And I am Uli Bear. I'm a university professor and the faculty director of the Center for the Humanities here at New York University. And it's really a great pleasure to welcome 5 of my colleagues here from different disciplines and schools to talk about collaborative teaching or team teaching. And I just want to say 2 words about that. The Center for Humanities is really a kind of resource and platform for faculty across all of NYU schools, appointed in any institute or center or school at the university, and for students and the public at large. And one of the things that we've been doing at the center is encouraging and facilitating and trying to create opportunities for team teaching and new approaches to teaching. One of the groups today will talk about the pandemic and plagues, of course they taught. And if there's one thing we may actually take from this pandemic is that everybody was challenged to really rethink and to think about pedagogy of what we really actually do in a new way and sometimes in creative ways. And I think that's a great moment for us to come together and talk about what you've done over the last 2 years or so, maybe in a team teaching format. The Center for the Humanities, which I co-direct with Molly Rogers. Thank you, Molly, for being here, and Kyla Bowen, who is here for our tech support. Thank you also, Kyla, for setting all this up. Also awards grants to faculty, NYU faculty, for team teaching opportunities to get you started. And we're also here to help faculty from NYU think through some of the institutional challenges and hurdles or opportunities, how to actually work with somebody in a different school or department, since there are other things attached besides getting together intellectually and pedagogically. There are also ways in which students enroll in courses and all of that kind of behind the scenes work. We're also here to help people think through. I'll introduce my colleagues here and then I'll leave it to you. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We're recording this and we've done this for several years now. It's been very productive as a workshop for other faculty to learn and discover and think more about team teaching. And the groups so here today, the first group is Krishnendu and Rene Arcilla, who've been teaching a course called Feeding Body and Soul. Krishnendu is professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University, where he was the chair from 2012 until 21. He's the author of The Migrant's Table, The Ethnic Restaurateur, and the co-editor of Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food, and South Asia. He was also a faculty member and the acting associate dean of liberal arts at the Culinary Institute of America, and has done many other things. And Krishnendu, I'm really happy you're here today to talk about your presence in the classroom. Rene Arcilla is professor of philosophy of education, also at NYU in the Steinhardt School. He is the author of For the Love of Perfection, Richard Rorty and Liberal Education, Mediumism, a philosophical reconstruction of modernism for existential learning, and Wim Wenders' road movie Philosophy, Education Without Learning. So I was happy to see that you have filled with fondness for Richard Rorty, one of whose essay I'm actually republishing in a new edition of one of Freud's books, and fondness for Wim Wenders, who made a film about my hometown that has influenced a lot of people. He's also the co-editor of A Life in Classrooms, Philip W. Jackson, and The Practice of Education. So Rene and Krishnendu are going to start us out in their conversation about feeding body and soul. And then the second group are 3 additional colleagues who taught a course called Pandemic and Plagues. And they are Patrick Deere, who is associate professor and director of undergraduate studies in the English department and the Faculty of Arts and Science at NYU, where he teaches modern and contemporary British, American, and Anglophone lit. He's also the faculty coordinator of NYU's Cultures of War and the Post-War Research Group, which the Center for the Humanities initially, I think, started to help to set up. And we've been really excited and pleased how much you've been able to do about writing about the representation of war and actually veterans and other people actively writing in creative writing groups. So it's a very broad concept. You're not just doing research, but actually getting people involved. And he co-hosts the Awards After War Civilian Veteran Writers Workshop. He's published Culture and Camouflage, War Empire and Modern British Literature, and other journal articles and other things on this topic. Perri Klass is professor of journalism and pediatrics at New York University, appointed in several departments and schools, not in the same department. and co-director of NYU Florence in Italy. She also practices pediatrics at Bellevue. She has published widely about medicine and children's issues in publications ranging from the New York Times to the Washington Post, Smithsonian, and other publications and venues. And her new book is The Best Medicine: How Science and Public Health Gave Children a Future. And I think that has just, Perri, when did this come out? Like The Best Medicine?
Well, the paperback is about to come out in a week.
About to come out, great. So, and the third person in your team teaching team is Trace Jordan, who's clinical professor and director of the Foundations of Scientific Inquiry program in the core curriculum in the College of Arts and Science at New York University, where many of us also teach a wide range of courses. He's the lead author of Chemistry, the Molecules of Life, and is a 3-time recipient of the Golden Dozen Teaching Award, which is a remarkable achievement and especially noteworthy since it's nominated by students and not by your colleagues. So it means a lot more, I think, in my book, that you've actually been the recipient of this. So we'll go first with Rene and Krishnendu about feeding body and soul, and then we'll move on. And as I said, this is being recorded. We consider this a workshop. I actually received a teaching grant from the Humanities Center many, many years ago when I wasn't director with my friend Shelley Rice. And I think we have been teaching together for 16 years now because of a grant we got 16 years ago. And it has completely changed my pedagogy, my research, and my presence at the university. So it's been a wonderful experience. So we're really grateful you're here. Maybe tell us a little bit how you came up with the idea for this course, what was behind it, how it worked. Also feel free to tell us what didn't really work. And then part of the conversation, as I said before we started, is also for you 5 to have a conversation amongst yourselves to learn from the experiences you've had. So thank you again, and I'll get off screen, but of course I'll be present, and I really look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm glad to begin. Good evening, everybody. I'm Rene, and it's a real pleasure for me to talk about this great experience I shared with Krishnendu teaching this course. We had a brief conversation, Krishnendu and I, about how to present this, and we thought, well, maybe it would be fitting if I talk a little bit about the theory of the course, and then being the philosopher, and Krishnendu could talk about what actually happened and the empirical findings, so to speak. So with that spirit in mind, maybe it's worth starting by just saying a few sentences about the history of this class. We owe a lot, I think, Krishnendu and I, to the leadership and the encouragement of Jim Fraser, a colleague of mine at NYU Steinhardt, a historian of education. Because some years back, maybe 2016, 2017, Jim started encouraging those of us who do humanities research at NYU Steinhardt to meet regularly and talk a little bit about our work. We work in a school where the dominant mode of research and scholarship is in the social sciences. And so sometimes there's a less than perfect understanding of what it is exactly that we do, those of us who are in humanities. And, we're not entirely aware of each other's existence. So it was a great opportunity it was a great opportunity for me, speaking personally, to meet some of my colleagues that I hadn't met before, that I'd barely known was around, and one of them was Krishnendu. So in the course of these meetings, we were all encouraged to start thinking about collaborative projects that we might take up together. And concurrently with this, what also transpired is there began to emerge an interest at Steinhardt to maybe design some freshman seminars. These would be small classes that would be geared to first-year undergrads. And the central aim would be to try to encourage and improve the retention of these students. Give them a first taste of what NYU has to offer that might intrigue them and lead them to pursue more in the way of academics and study. So with Jim's encouragement, with the encouragement of Steinhardt's leadership, with the encouragement of Molly and others at the NYU Center for the Humanities, with the encouragement of Vice Dean Dopico, a number of these seminars were proposed and supported, and Feeding Body and Soul is one of these. So when Krishnendu and I approached the design of this course, we knew that we wanted to create something that was a little unusual, a little bit different from the routine, the run-of-the-mill, including the kinds of courses that he and I normally teach, something that would be a little bit wilder, that might create a buzz. So as we put our heads together to think about this, we focused on the idea of, okay, maybe we could take a professional area of work and concern and look at how different disciplines approach this area. What could be more basic than the role of food in our lives? So that became the centerpiece. We also wanted to try to engage students with parts of New York City that connect to this interest. Alas, we taught just as the pandemic was peaking. So some of the plans that we had made for that didn't fully come off, but we did manage to introduce the students to a number of spots where that were interested in food and its different dimensions. And of course, maybe the main motif that we concentrated on is the idea that we could talk about hunger and food in both its literal dimensions and its figurative dimensions. Hence the title of the course, Feeding Body and Soul, where we talk about feeding the physical body and then the ways in which that suggests what we need to do to nourish our souls. So the course is built around this cross-disciplinary contrast between myself, a philosopher, Krishnendu, a sociologist and social scientist. We also approach study slightly different ways. I learned a lot from him about the powers of reading text with an eye to how they're shaped by their context, how their significance is bound up with their context, social and historical. Whereas my own normal approach is to focus on close interpretive reading, to look at the ambiguities in text and try and tease these out and explore the possible meanings in anything that seems unequivocal. And then, of course, too, we also, as we designed our syllabus, tried to arrive at a balance between contemporary texts and classical texts, and texts that speak to different parts of the world, that come from different moments of history, and so forth. So those are some introductory thoughts. Krishnendu, you want to add to any of that?
Thanks a lot, Rene. I will, Rene, you wanted me to share the syllabus. I located it.
Oh, good.
So let me see, and that might be a way to, hold on, talk about it. Can you see the syllabus, Rene?
Yes.
Yes, good.
That's great.
So hi, everyone. My name is Krishnendu Ray, and this is exactly as Rene was saying. I'm going to just show you what the syllabus looked like and some of the topics, and then some takeaways for me, and in the process, and some of the challenges that Rene has already mentioned. to give you a sense, we had, this was in fact the toughest part to figure out the learning objectives, because it's often implied and intuitive. And so having to negotiate the learning objectives between the two of us and the TA was excruciating, but we got there, and I think it was better because of that. We had to make explicit. As one, you can see synthesized text from multiple disciplines to inform our ideas about food and nourishment. And then the second one was apply academic readings to lived experience. And I'll show you some things in the syllabus that we tried to intersect between the two. So between the disciplines, between living and thinking, and shares responses and ideas through formal and informal writing and discussion. Just to give a taste of the units here. The first one, what Rene already mentioned, literal and figurative. So we started with the hunger artist, Kafka, inevitably, the Franny and Zoe, and then we went to Gandhi, and especially his use of fasting as an important political tool. And here we also brought in later an advocate and representative of the Manhattan Sikh Center, who were feeding people during the pandemic and also during the Black Lives Matter movement. And so it was, again, this one of the objectives of this piece was to introduce the students in a thoughtful way to their city. And in this case, New York City, because many of the students are, of course, from elsewhere. Some of them are from New York City. Most are from elsewhere, to give them a footing in the city. That was one of the objectives. And then they, of course, usually had to write paper or some commentary. That we also wanted to make sure that they just did not become a grim course on hunger and suffering, but also joy and pleasure, which is in fact rare in the social sciences and the humanities, but in some ways for good reason. But we also wanted to bring in some of the critiques of consumerism. And most of you would be familiar with the Society of the Spectacle. And there was also this negotiation between Rene and me, and reading stuff I had either read long ago or had not read, and then engaging with it and bringing a sociological point of view, which tends to be a lot more contextual and sometimes sweeping compared to a philosopher's close reading. And so it was these very kind of different styles. And on each unit, we also send them on an exercise. They had to go to a market, in this case, Essex Street Market and Hudson Yards, and make a comparison about consumerism, consumer society, the joys of consumerism and the liabilities of it. And maybe a couple of, then we also read High on the Hog, which eventually came out, in fact, as a Netflix show on Jessica Harris's travels to West Africa, specifically Senegal. And so this was also made us very cool that we were updated, and that the students had already read something that was going to come out on Netflix. So that added street cred to us. And so anyway, I'm going to stop sharing okay, so and finish my thoughts about some of this. In terms of maybe the last couple of minutes, I'm going to spend talking about some of the pleasures and the challenges of co-teaching. The first thing was, like our, in some ways, what outcomes we were after, learning objectives. It foregrounded for me what is usually in the back of my mind. And I have the toughest time articulating that in the right bureaucratic language of an education school. So the outcomes assessment aspect of it. So the foregrounding of it, and in fact, explicit conversations around it was very productive. And it also showed up some of my bad habits, which is I give too much to read. And it is not reasonable to expect my students to read as much as I really have them to read on the syllabus. So between the three of us, that negotiation. So how many pages are really essential? So I think we kept an upper limit if possible, 25, 30, 50 pages, depending on density of the material. That was good, refreshing, and that is going to shape my subsequent teaching because I realize I give too much to read and it's really unreasonable. And in fact, it creates a scattered reading rather than focused reading. So for me, that was kind of both the pleasure of it and a lesson coming out of it. The second one is we tend to talk about not being an authoritative center, but being in a classroom with 3 people who have different degrees of shared authority. Rene, me, and the teaching assistant really exhibited how, in some ways, teaching can happen in a lot more dialogic way, in a lot more iterative way, rather than the singular, the sage on the stage way that the structure of a classroom inevitably traps some of us in. So it allowed us to show more than tell that how knowledge production could be a collaborative kind of an effort and not always congruent, you know, and there was some disagreements and differences and how to manage them in a good way, in a productive way. And I think what that also allowed the students to do between the disciplines, so let's call it the sociology and philosophy, to check their affinities, because a lot of decisions we make in what we do is what we like to do, right? And what kind of knowledge do we want to acquire? What kind of reading do we want to do? More contextual or close reading. We, in some ways, allowed us to do a bit of kind of modeling different kinds of academic behavior in some ways. And I would say maybe the last 2 things is that it was very good for me because I think one of the tragedies of the way the university is constituted is there's intense, what I call mutual epistemic disdain between social sciences and philosophy and sciences, okay? And so this allowed us to undermine the natural tendency to be doing the boundary work of our discipline, saying how sociology is always better than philosophy, no matter what, or the other way around, right? And in some ways, this really underlined the capacity to engage with different forms of knowledge, different forms of evidentiary rules, for instance, that are in some ways produced in the discipline. And student witnessed its kind of uses and pleasures and some of the antagonisms and some of the congruences about it. And going back to the learning objectives about reading different kinds of texts and analyzing, bringing in experience of the city and textual reading, I think we were modestly successful, and it turned out to be a lot more enjoyable than I thought I had initially imagined it to be. I'll stop there.
Yeah, if I could just, I'm just going to underscore your last point and then turn it over to the next team. But I want to leave on the idea of this was fun. And what was fun about it, among other things, was the idea of working for me with a very different kind of scholar like yourself, Krishnendu, coming from a different discipline, with different interests, different ways of approaching the world, exploring very directly those differences, making them public, showing them, but at the same time, always knowing that you can trust this person because we're both invested in the success of this class. And so that's a rare experience, and I enjoyed it. I'm sure that well, I could sense that the students were also, taken by the infectiousness of all this. So, anyways, it was a great experience. So we're happy to talk about this more in the rest of the period. Why don't we pass the torch to the next team?
Oh, one last thing. We're going to do it again. So
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to talk about a course that we taught in in a pandemic spring, a course that was called Pandemics and Plagues. And it was intended as a medical humanities course, and it grew, and that's what I'm here to tell you about, out of a working group in the medical humanities, which was sponsored here at the center. So I want to start by talking about a little bit about what is, or if you prefer, what are the medical humanities? What is the field? What makes it up, and what were we doing? How did this course come to be? And what I would start by saying is that it is an inherently collaborative interdisciplinary field. The whole point of bringing the scholarly lenses of the disciplines in the humanities to bear on topics of health and medicine and sickness is to bring an interdisciplinary eye, to take subjects which may have been discussed in a medical school, in a science department, and see how much more we can understand when we look at them with other scholarly tools. Now, medical humanities or health humanities has meant many things and still does mean many things to many people, in the sense that for medical students, for example, medical humanities may mean let's make sure the medical students are exposed to some medical history, some bioethics, some of the thinking which doesn't come just out of the departments of anatomy, pathology, and the various medical specialties. And let's try to, if we may, humanize, let's try to broaden their outlook. But it's also a field of really interesting, burgeoning scholarship within arts and science. And it's a field which offers us the opportunity, we think, and this was part of our program as a working group here, offers us opportunities for interdisciplinary education. So we had been leading a working group for faculty at the Center for the Humanities on the medical humanities, drawing on faculty members from many disciplines, talking about the different kinds of scholarship that came out of art history, out of literature, out of music, in talking about issues of health and medicine. And one of the goals of this group was to think about developing an opportunity for undergraduate education here at NYU in the medical humanities, as a way to give, again, interdisciplinary opportunities to undergraduates to draw those who were in the pre-health curriculum into classes in literature, art history, philosophy, bioethics, and to draw those who were in those fields in the humanities and also some of the social sciences into courses which engage directly with issues of health medicine. And I have to say, on a personal note, being part of this working group was always intellectually stimulating, fascinating, eye-opening. But as we headed into the pandemic and found ourselves talking, usually now on Zoom, but again, out of our different disciplines about the times that we were living through, it was a tremendous source of intellectual interest and also support. And out of this mix, the desire to find a way to offer these opportunities to undergraduates to maybe pilot such a course, the knowledge that we were living through a time which was of a time of tremendous medical and biological interest, development, things changing every day, but also a time when all of the other disciplines in the humanities had something to offer, something to say. We decided to teach a plagues and pandemics course for undergraduates to co-teach it remotely, drawing again on the kinds of expertise and insight which we had been regularly ourselves drawing on from the working group, and also teach it as a kind of real-time experiment. That is to say, while we plan to discuss historical plagues, historical pandemics, and historical insights, we were very aware that the word pandemic in the course title in the year 2021 would not seem to our students like a word that came out of history, but would instead be a word that for them would have everyday resonance, and that all of the issues that would come up as we discussed these historical plagues and pandemics would resonate for them in ways that we didn't necessarily know how to predict, since after all, the times we were living through were part of that evolving story. And having said that, let me hand over to you, Patrick.
Thanks so much, Perri, and it is really great to be here with everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we designed the syllabus, and which was a collaborative enterprise. And I'll just share my screen briefly, so that you can have a look at it also. Here's this wonderful image from a medical archive. I should also mention that not here today is very much our other scholarly collaborator, Dr. Kim Adams, who was a core postdoc, now an ACLS fellow in the public humanities at Stanford. The idea for the course came out of our Center for the Humanities, Medical Humanities Working Group, and the four of us, Perri, Trace, Kim, and I, we had the challenge of producing a syllabus between the four of us. Trace is going to talk about how he brilliantly orchestrated how we would co-teach together, which really worked. But we decided, given the challenge of the course, to and I'll just show you, a little bit of the syllabus, to break it up into 2-week units. This was actually a 2-point course, so it met online once a week. It filled right up, and we had students from all over NYU, different schools, different departments. So what we had to do was to take not only a potentially vast topic, but also something that was happening in real time during a pandemic, and kind of make it accessible to humanities students, social sciences. We had pre-health students, global health too. It was pretty fantastic, some STEM students. But again, to cut across those disciplinary divides. So we decided that working with 2-week units was a good way of moving. And as you can see from our initial unit on bubonic plague, we also crowdsourced from the people we knew, from the medical humanities group, working group mainly, visiting speakers. So we would have guest speakers parachute in one session, because the course met once a week. And then the following week, we would have a discussion session on literary or other kinds of readings. And the course was capped at 40, and so those sessions we would break up into breakout sections. So the challenge was to find a mix of readings that would be accessible both to students who knew about science and medicine, and also to those for whom the medical humanities was a new experience. So we mixed bubonics and plagues. We were transhistorical often. The course moved chronologically. We went back to the Renaissance, Boccaccio's Decameron, but we also read parts of Albert Camus' novel The Plague from 1947. Other sort of highlights were thinking about the 1918 influenza pandemic, mislabeled the Spanish flu. This was, a global pandemic that killed many more people than World War I did, and yet it doesn't feature much either in popular memory or literature. So it was a way of connecting historical plagues to the present by having the students think about memory. I mean, whose stories counted during the COVID-19 pandemic as it unfolded, how it was going to be archived, how would we remember all this and process it. The other real standout in the course, I think, that really struck us, and I think this was true for all of us, was the unit on HIV/AIDS, an epidemic that was very much localized to New York City that then is now a global pandemic. This really struck a chord for the students. They didn't have much memory of it, and this was really striking. So we had different genres on the syllabus. In this case, we had a activist play by Larry Kramer, The Normal Heart, clips from Angels in America, an amazing presentation from Professor Fidelindo Lim from the nursing School of Nursing at Langone, and some poetry from Rafael Campo. But we built in nonfiction readings as well. And I would say overall, it was just a really fantastic experience. And I would be happy to talk a bit more about the logistics of designing and sequencing the design and coming up with a syllabus between 4 faculty. But we made it work, and we've had a chance, we're scaling it up into a 4-point elective. So we've had a chance to revisit it. But I think the last thing I'd say about designing a syllabus collaboratively, and this came up in Rene and Krishnendu's wonderful previous presentation, was how much dialogue we were able to have, how productive it was to come at this from I'm a literature professor, to work with someone in Perri, who's in journalism and pediatrics, Trace, who is a proper scientist in the core, Kim, who's a medical humanities postdoc. It was a really rewarding experience. I would thoroughly recommend it. And I think the collaboration and the excitement started with the syllabus design. Trace, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Patrick. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about how we implemented our co-teaching philosophy for each class. So as Patrick mentioned, there were 4 people on the teaching team. There were 3 faculty, Perri, Patrick, me, and also our wonderful postdoctoral fellow, Kim Adams. So one of the challenges became, how do we find space for everyone's voice in each class? And that was something that we thought was really important. We didn't want one class to be taught by Perri, and then one class to be taught by Patrick, and one class to be taught by me. We wanted this to be really a collaborative venture where everyone's voice was heard in every class. So I came up with the idea of creating a lesson plan, which we circulated before each class. And so what I did with the lesson plan is put together an overview of essentially a timeline of the class, and also a breakdown of who was going to be doing the introductions, who was going to be doing an overview of the readings, roughly how long things were going to take, and really to create space for each of us to contribute to each class. We had to coordinate all of this via Zoom, so there were lots of emails, lots of attachments, lots of shared Google Docs during the course of the week before we taught our class on Monday morning. So just to give you a sense of what a typical class might look like, let's say a discussion class, we would start where Patrick would welcome the students. We would debrief a little bit about what happened in the previous class. Then Patrick would give an overview of the key themes for the current class. Perri would introduce the readings and some of the key points. Then what we would do is break into 2 breakout rooms. Perri and Patrick took 1 breakout room, and Kim and I took another breakout room. So we would facilitate class discussion for about 45 minutes in those breakout rooms. Then we would reconvene into the larger group for further discussion. As we neared the end of the course, Kim would take over and talk about the course assignments. So students were responsible for either discussion questions or reflection papers each week. And then I would typically wrap up the course with a reflection question. So I would ask students to write in the chat, what is the one take-home lesson that you learned from today's class? And we found that this final reflection exercise was really, really valuable. It gave us great insights into what students learned. It gave each student in the class a chance to reflect on the readings and the discussion. And the nice thing also is that it let everyone participate, including students who maybe were less comfortable speaking on camera during the breakout rooms or in the larger discussion. The other thing that we did is also perform a fairly detailed assessment of the course and student learning using an instrument that I had used before called the Student Assessment of Learning Gains. So we asked students to provide metacognitive reflections on what they had learned, and we asked them questions about what did you learn about the medical humanities? How did this course change your perspective on pandemics and plagues? And what was the perspective on understanding the varieties of teaching and different disciplinary perspectives? And we found that those responses were very, very rich. And they were so rich, in fact, that we took them and distilled them together with the narrative of teaching the course and published a paper that was published in the Journal of the Medical Humanities in a special issue on medical humanities education. So that is really how we taught pandemics and plagues. It was really very much a collaborative venture, but we found that the lesson plans and going over an overview of each of us and our responsibilities was really helpful in creating coherence to the course, in ensuring everyone's voices was heard, and also to give space for valuable pedagogical practices, such as giving students time to do Zoom reflections in the chat. So I think that sums up our experiences with pandemics and plagues, and maybe I'll hand back to Uli for the next session of our webinar.
Thank you to the 2 groups. I'd be curious, I think maybe Rene or Krishnendu said that the kind of mutual epistemic skepticism about different disciplines, how people come to knowledge. And both of you looked at, so in some ways, it will be interesting to think in your first class on food, to think, how do you define what constitutes hunger for people? Could be an economic indicator, could be a psychological, personal one, and come at different solutions. And the other one is for your other class. We've been living through something that has been defined in certain ways, but there are debates what we are in now, pandemic, endemic, plague, and the definitions in some ways, whether the students actually sort of learned what these epistemic differences are, how we arrive at even the objects of our study. Maybe you could say something like that about that. I would be interested in whether the students grasp that, because they're not necessarily trained in all these disciplines represented in this room right now.
Rene, go for it first, and then I'll go.
Rene, you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I think if I recall correctly, Krishnendu, we began by imagining an alien coming down to Earth and looking at human behavior and saying, okay, well, you use the word food in these circumstances, but then it somehow has this extended meaning as well, and so forth. So it's a fanciful trope, and it goes only so far. But I think the basic idea was precisely to defamiliarize, right, a lot of this territory, to take something as basic and elementary as eating and food and so forth, and to slowly get people used to the idea that there's all these different dimensions to it, and that actually what seems utterly self-evident, banally so, is actually richer and more mysterious in a sense. So I don't know if Krishnendu would agree with this, but I was often, I often felt like part of my mission was to make it a little mysterious, you know, to drive it toward the questions more than the answers. Do you want to add anything to that, Krishnendu?
Yeah, so in some ways, food and eating, we almost started with an inverted view of it. We started with hunger and both the structural hunger, where you try not to be hungry, you try to get food, but you cannot get food. And then the metaphoric hunger is, we started with the starving artist, and we started with Gandhi willfully not eating, right? So this was to kind of to complicate that, to draw attention to this basically practice. So much of eating is kind of unself-conscious. Like a lot of good behavioral research is also showing that this is almost a kind of fast thinking. This is not, most of it is not, you don't sit and wonder and do a philosophical analysis of the food before you eat it. Some aspects of it, animals, for instance, are beginning to enter that discussion about eating animals in the Western world. So some of it was to, as Rene said, to defamiliarize and then, of course, connect it to the students' experiences, for instance, eating disorders came up in different ways, and even take something so obvious like chewing and swallowing, and then you add chewing and swallowing. We don't usually think about it, at least not since we were probably infants. Perri would correct me on that. But in some ways, what if when you introduce dysphagia to it, right, which is swallowing disorders? Because in my department, we do teach a class where, in fact, food students and rehabilitative science students and physical therapy students come together in thinking about dysphagia. And so that space between the humanities and the physiological, which is often falls in the gap, was some of the lovely intersection to be at and to be interrogating. And in some ways, in this case, making the familiar a bit unfamiliar, which turned out to be, if you started really thinking about it, not that uncommon, in fact, in people's experiences.
So, yeah, it's I mean, that's such a great question, Uli. How do we arrive at the object of our study? In a way, and Perri and Trace, I'd love to hear your reflections on this. But in a way, we sort of began with the opposite problem about, you know, we always have the challenge of connecting our students, connecting what we're teaching to their own experience. And the COVID-19 pandemic had already defamiliarized everything. And we weren't, in the spring of 2021, time gets blurry in the pandemic, but we were at a particular upbeat moment. The vaccines had been discovered. There was the challenge was now to distribute them. We weren't anywhere near a new normal. So, and we were worried that it was going to be too much for our students. You know, I mean, I teach war literature and representations of violence. So I tell my students, look, the whole course has a trigger warning on it, but this is a safe space, and, you know, we're going to deal with some intense stuff. But I think the students were just up for the intellectual challenge. And on the one hand, there was something about engaging with really rigorously with the objects of study, with the different texts. They would often say how much they enjoyed the intellectual effort of reflection, and also because we were teaching, literature and some plays and movies along with nonfiction stuff. What I think one thing we said to them was, look, one of the traditional functions of literature is diversion and entertainment. Look at the Decameron. The prologue's all about the ethics and morality of being in a plague. And then they go off to a beautiful palace and they tell stories that have nothing to do with the bubonic plague, in Italy. And I mean, the other thing that was very striking is the students only posed that question for us. I remember early on, one of, I think it was an English major said, I think when Perri would do brilliant framing mini lectures on the science of each disease, because we wanted to make sure that they had it. And a student said, am I allowed to ask questions, Professor Klass, about bubonic plague? Because I don't have a medical degree. I'm not, I don't know anything about biology. Can I speak? And the answer was, yeah, we're all wrestling with this together. Yeah, Perri, did you want to respond?
Well, the answer is yes, but you need to know what you're talking about. And it was very important to me in this course that while we might consider, if you will, illness as metaphor, we also consider illness not as metaphor. I thought, we now live in an era when, for the most part, most reasonably educated people know the difference between viruses and bacteria, but these are important things. You can't talk in a real and an educated, in a comfortable way about the pandemics without coming to some kind of engagement with the microbiology, with the epidemiology, with the pathology. And the challenge to us, of course, was to teach that without putting up the barriers that are put up by jargon, that are put up by the lecture, which makes the English major feel, oh, I can't be in the room, I don't belong here. But that it felt very important. I think that anybody who studies infectious diseases or who studies the history of plagues and pandemics, the infections themselves are characters. They have personality. They behave in, you want different mood music when it's tuberculosis. And yes, we can talk about tuberculosis and music, and we had a lecturer who talked about it brilliantly, but I want you to understand that, exactly what the infection is, what it is doing to the body in pathological terms, as we consider what it is doing to the body and the body politic in more metaphorical terms. And I think being willing again and again to come back to that and say, you certainly do belong in the room, you English major, but you're part of a conversation which also includes the biology.
Right. And just to leap in, and just like we heard in the wonderful course on food, this course on pandemics and plagues really was so directly connected to students' lived experience of living through a pandemic, and it was always there. And especially at the end during our discussions of COVID-19 and during the assessment, we asked students to reflect on how did the course affect their own experiences of living through a pandemic. And a lot of the students said at the beginning, I was hesitant, I was concerned that it would be a bit too much, that I would just find it a bit too sort of depressing. But there was one quote I remember explicitly in the feedback, was that I thought that this course was going to be difficult, but by talking about historical pandemics, it made it easier for me to process my experiences of living through a pandemic myself. So I really do think that connecting students' lived experiences to the course content was a very big factor in its success.
I would be curious if I could maybe, I mean, I would have a couple other questions about the epistemological concern, but whether there are things that you feel you learned from teaching this course that you will now take with you, maybe even into a class that you're teaching not with other people, whether there's certain practices, and part of it is also Zoom related surely, but whether something you actually would do differently because you have had this experience just in your own practice of teaching.
One thought that I had was, and this is also shaped by my experience of being a faculty fellow in residence, which, Trace also does. But so we had nearly 40 students and they were zooming in from all over the world. There was one student in India, and there were students in Queens, who's New York City, and they reflected on, the unequal and devastating effect on their own community of the pandemic. And there was a way in which the unevenness of this global event kind of, it didn't creep into the Zoom classroom. It was there. So I sort of think one thing I'm taking away from this is just being really alert to, in person, the students all come into the room and we're in this space together, but just thinking in very material ways about just how uneven their location can be, where they're coming from. I mean, it was something that I feel like I tried to, create, when you try and create a diverse syllabus, an inclusive environment, but just really think in very material terms, access, what was going on if they had the camera off. Well, I'm having to do childcare for my sibling. I think that has shifted my my pedagogy, and so I mean that's one thought, and also I would say being willing to take risks and go out of your comfort zone, because engaging with Perri as a pediatrician, Trace as a scientist, and really kind of digging into the science. I mean, there's a way in which we were giving our students permission to engage in a dialogue from all sorts of different disciplines. But I think it's really important and renewing to give yourself permission, as a scholar and a teacher, just to change it up. I mean, I was very struck, Uli, you said you started team teaching 16 years ago, and it really does, I think, seeking out those opportunities. And then I sort of feel like even if I'm not in the same classroom as Perri or Trace or Kim or some of my other classrooms, I'm just going to find ways to bring them in, even if it's inviting colleagues in for a guest session, but just thinking about the boundaries of the classroom as a bit more permeable, that this really is a collaboration, what we're engaged in.
I can just echo briefly something that Patrick said, because it resonates so strongly with me. I think the beauty of this situation is that it brings out the improvisational, right? It kind of, working with Krishnendu, there is much more of that element of the unpredictable, the fact that you, as you say, Patrick, are taken out of your habitual zone And since that experience, I've been thinking about how do I incorporate that more into my own solo teaching. It's not as easy to be that kind of to do that kind of improvisation when you're alone as you are with someone else. So I don't have an answer to the question, but that's certainly one of the things I'm thinking about.
I think I would just quickly add to that also is that improvisational. In some ways, we were doing more jazz than we have ever done before in my classroom. That's kind of my takeaway, where you had to tag on to what someone else had started and finish with it. I think it made me more agile, and it allowed me to show my vulnerability because I'm not always so smart thinking about something very clever to say in retort all the time. And that's space, right? And producing that space. And I would also underline what Patrick said. I think it made me, through the pandemic, through this form of teaching and this specific form of teaching, attentive to the unevenness of social locations. And in some ways, technologies, chat function, has been a beauty. And like my students, who are about a third of my students, generally talk in class. About a third of the students never talk, or I have to force them. And about a third talk once in a while. And it got distributed where a lot of the students who were not talking were also chatting. And to incorporate the chat function has become a real lesson for me. And I have to figure out how to replicate it in an in-person class now, going forward. And I would say the last thing, this also broke my bad habit, as I said, I give too much reading. To manage my readings better, is a very important lesson that I'm taking specifically to my other classes.
Perri and Trace, is there something in our corporate speak a takeaway from this experience into your school teaching?
I mean, teaching within the journalism department, I've always really enjoyed teaching courses which draw students from the different journalism pathways, from, documentary film, from, literary reportage, from multimedia, having them in the same class around the table. This was a much more intense version of that. It's really fun to have a group of students coming from very, very different backgrounds read the same complicated, interesting text and try to find ways to get them to react and to talk to one another. And I think you heard, especially from Trace, about the value of, for example, asking people for a final comment, because again, as has been said, there are people who keep quiet all through the class on Zoom, and you think, oh, they're probably checking their email, and then you ask for a parting thought, and they can, they're not going to open up and say it, but they've been thinking and they've got something to say. And I thought it was, that the different reflections and refractions of having the interdisciplinary group of faculty, both the core group of us, but also our many guest lecturers who were willing to come and sometimes present and, speak pretty informally. And then also that very mixed interdisciplinary group of students was really exciting.
Yes, Uli, for me, I think it was really the opportunity to have an intellectual discussion with somebody outside my discipline. As Patrick mentioned, I'm trained as a scientist, have a PhD in chemistry. I've always had an interest in humanities. I also have a master's in history and philosophy of science. And so that interest has always been there, but has been a bit dormant for a while. And every time that Kim Adams, our wonderful postdoctoral teaching fellow, and I would do the breakout rooms, we would always have a pre-game session. So we would meet at 11 and we I would always say, Kim, can you talk to me at 10:30? And so we would go over the readings together. And I thought it was very interesting how I, looking at the readings from the lens of either a scientist or a historian of science, which are the two hats that I wear, were quite different from how Kim, as a literary scholar, would look at the same readings. And she has a vast knowledge also of the medical humanities. So I thought it was very valuable how each of us could bring our own different viewpoint. Again, sort of like viewing the readings as a sculpture. You know, you can walk around the sculpture and you can look at it from different angles and see different things. And the angle that I might be looking at the sculpture from might be different from the one that Kim is looking at. But by putting those two angles together, we create a more three-dimensional view of the reading. And that's what I found to be the most personally enlightening and beneficial from this collaboration.
You know, I want to thank all of you. And I also want to add one thing. We have a Center for Advancement of Teaching. We have pedagogy workshops, instruction, but in my personal experience as a faculty member, I had never been given formal pedagogy instruction at NYU. I've been given at another institution. That actually there's a kind of moment when team teaching becomes that moment when you can rethink your teaching and you're accountable in a new way because you actually have a colleague in the room. And it's not an evaluation, but you have to actually think on your feet. And as Rene said, you have to improvise. And it's a really wonderful thing to actually be in a room and not have this sometimes unearned authority over your students because you give them grades, etc. They pay, but the other person in the room is thinking this is maybe not quite working, and they can help you out. And that is actually a benefit. They can actually help you out and say this could work better. And you learn things what they're doing, and you realize, oh my God, they're getting this response, or this has actually happened. They formulated a question. I didn't think of that. I think that part is something I would like to thank this group and all of you, and think a little bit. There was a question in the chat, how many classes are taught by groups of faculty. It's an economic consideration, a financial consideration, but it's not only that. And I would really like to ask you if you would become informal ambassadors and advocates for this experience. It is very important for your colleagues to hear you had a very positive experience in this format. And a lot of people, especially we have a lot of new faculty to the university constantly who don't know this is an option and have probably not thought about it. So if you can share this experience, we at the Center for Humanities will make it available to everybody, etc. But it would be really important to even talk to your colleagues in your units, departments, and schools and say, this has been a really, really wonderful experience for the students and for us. And once it's a good experience for students, the university actually moves and makes these things possible. So it's not that the financial considerations are paramount, but if there's an improved experience for students, I think everybody gets behind it. Are there any closing thoughts? I'll give you the floor and then we'll wrap this up. If you guys want to sort of say one thing, or maybe also, because this is recorded for future groups, of something that they could think about, or anything else you would like to add that we haven't touched upon.
I'll say something. It's a cliche in medicine, but a true cliche, to say that the pleasure of the field is that you are always both a teacher and a learner. And that is true and should be true about teaching in a university, but I would say it was profoundly true for me in this class. It was a class which repeatedly brought back to me not just the joys of teaching, but the joys of the different kinds of learner that I could be.
Anybody else? Thank you.
Yeah, a quick thought would be, at a extraordinarily, big and bustling and vibrant place like NYU, and even in, departments at schools where there's a lot of going on. I would just echo Uli's remarks about just going for it. And if there's, if there's a colleague whose work strikes a chord with you or resonates, and you think, this could be a cool opportunity for my students and the colleagues' students and other people, I would say just go for it. And I think it's brilliant, Uli, that at the Center for the Humanities, you're supporting this kind of innovation. And I think just being willing to take that risk and make those connections, and then see what's possible out of the collaboration. It's definitely worth the effort, and a really renewing and transforming experience, as Perri was saying.
I would also underline what Perri said, is the teacher and the learner. And for me, what was really, really enjoyable is how do you do pedagogical rethinking without sitting on those nightmare 3-hour workshops, how to do pedagogical rethinking. This was rethinking in the classroom. It was brilliant. It was practical. It was improvised, instigated, because I find those teaching how to teach classes excruciating. So here is content and form and pedagogy, and I have never been, in some ways, my pedagogical point of view has never been refreshed in the way it was refreshed in this class.
Yeah, maybe we could say that what the opportunity gives you is precisely the incentive to stretch yourself, to try something new, to be experimental, precisely because you know that even when you have a bad day, there's somebody else to save the day. There's plenty of times when I just wasn't on the top of my game, but Krishnendu was there, and he could sense me waffling around, and he would just jump in. So I think that's one of the great things, and because you know that you have that backup, you can try things that you wouldn't. You don't have to play it safe all the time. You can try different things.
And I just wanted to leap in and say that since this event is sponsored by the MOU Center for the Humanities, just a note of thanks for the support of these interdisciplinary ventures. So Perri and I were co-directors of the Medical Humanities Working Group, and that was very much a outgrowth of a working group grant from the center. And out of that working group came these interdisciplinary discussions and collaborations. And that's how we got to know Patrick, because Patrick had a previous working group grant. And so Patrick became part of the team. And then out of that came the idea of teaching. And we also got support from the Center for Team Teaching to support our wonderful postdoctoral fellows. So I do think that the work that the center is doing in seeding these initiatives is really, really important, because I think if you have the imprimatur of a working group grant or a collaborative teaching grant from the center, I think it really helps to highlight and to disseminate, and also to sort of shine a light on all of the good things that we're doing. But the support for the center was really essential for us. So thank you very much for that.
Well, Therese, I really appreciate it. And I'll hand it right on to Molly, because Molly Rogers has been so brilliant about actually getting to know the working groups, the team teaching ones, and actually really sort of sitting down with faculty to think through what is the best way to do this, giving you all the space we hope that we can give you. And so it's really to Molly's credit, because she's really not managed, but actually we just try to create a space for people to fill out. We do not want to manage anything you're doing. We just want to sort of say, here's something you can figure out how to make it work. And we're really happy to hear that it seems to work. We're also just delighted that you came today. I want to thank you. So encourage other people to apply for grants, apply again. tell your school deans to pay for it next time. Thank you very much for NYU, because that is actually one of the things we do. We are a tiny little center, and we actually just want to do seed grants for other initiatives. So you should turn right around, go to your department chair and dean and say, this is a brilliant project, really benefits all the students. We come from different schools and it's worth doing. So I want to thank all of you. Thank Kyla for setting this up. Thank Molly for organizing all of this, and enjoy the rest of your semester teaching in whatever format you are, solo, with other people, with your students. And we hope to see you soon in person. Thank you.
Thanks so much.